Driving at night. True horror stories. Story number 1. This is the only experience I have ever had like this. Nothing else has come close. Some friends and I, 5 of us, were driving around some rural roads waiting for a friend to arrive to his girlfriend's house. We were just kind of wasting time, cruising down some dirt roads around 20 miles an hour, talking. My friend who is driving slams on his brakes and I, in the passenger seat, looked up and there was this thing. I had never seen anything like it before. We stopped the car and watched as this thing, which didn't have a perceivable head, moved slowly across the road about 15 feet in front of us. It was creepy to say the least. It was approximately 4 feet tall and we could see its joints moving as it walked slowly with a gait similar to a giraffe. It had very skinny, long legs. Its body was about 1.5 feet round. If it had hair it was pretty short, but the thing was brown. We were all screaming, "What the fuck is that?" We could not see any perceivable head and it was walking perpendicular to us. We watched as it slowly walked through these people's yard and behind their house. Needless to say we were freaking out about it. When we got to my friend's house we all drew pictures of it separately and showed each other at the same time when we were done to verify that we all saw what we saw. It was the strangest thing I have ever seen and I have not found any satisfactory explanation to this day, 20 years later. Story number 2. Driving to work early, still dark, got caught on scene as the paramedics and police were closing down the street. Man on a bike hit by a car, woman standing outside her car holding her face and staring at the man she hit totally inconsolable. Man on the ground, head contorted behind his back, legs splayed like a rag doll, shoes in the street with his toes facing the wrong way, his face bloodied and cut, and his butt half out of his pants while he convulsed, obviously dying from his injuries. I was forced to stay there while police figured out who saw what and who was involved, so I got to watch the guy die. I didn't work that day. Story number 3. I was driving from New Hampshire, USA, to Colorado Springs, Colorado, USA. We had to go through Kansas and never heard of a supercell. But apparently those beautiful clouds turn into swirly death traps called tornadoes. Well, as night hit and the strongest became difficult to drive through, we slowed down because it was hard to see through the downpouring rain. Well, lucky me looked outside to my left into a field and in between lightning flashes a tornado was swirling in motion about a mile away from us. I've never shat myself so fast and hard before. I tell you, I will never go back to Kansas in a Subaru Outback. If I go back it's gonna be in a tank. Story number 4. After seeing The Ring 2 with friends late one night, I had just dropped off one of them at their house in the middle of nowhere. I was driving down a dark rural road through trees and I turned a corner going fairly fast and there were like 5 deer in the middle of the road. I was able to stop before hitting them but I couldn't go anywhere until they moved, so I sat there until they finished crossing the road. If anyone remembers the terrible movie that was The Ring 2, there is this scene where they get stopped by a deer, then the deer attacks. That was all I could think about as I waited for the deer to cross. Realistically, it probably took less than a minute, but man did it feel like an hour. Eventually though they all pranced across and I kept driving. But to this day I still remember it and it still comes up in my nightmares sometimes. Story number 5. A lady tried to use my truck to commit suicide. I was going 40 and she jumped towards my truck. It happened so fast I couldn't stop in time and her head smashed out my driver's side window. Scared the shit out of me. At first I didn't know that I hit a person until I looked back and saw her body in the road. She didn't die that day, but as soon as she got out of the hospital, she went back and did the same thing. This time it was a semi-truck and she didn't make it. Super sad story. Story number 6. A lot of people that drive for a living or have done balls-to-the-wall cross-country drives can tell you about the running shadows. First time I saw MI was on the tail end of 12 straight hours of driving. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, in the desert, at night. Very little light from the sky, no man-made lights even on the horizon. Just the pitiful cone from my truck's headlamp, and being in the middle of the desert it pretty much only lights up the road ahead. Nothing above ground level to catch the light. As I'm barreling along I start to see shadowy figures running alongside my truck out of the corners of my eyes, on 2 legs and 4. All I can think about is the creepy stories you read online about shit that lives out in the desert, or the Asian ghost stories where if you don't acknowledge the spirit it can't harm you. So I've got my eyes glued to the road, refusing to let them flicker off to the side. I rolled my windows up and cranked up the volume on my radio. Drove like that for probably an hour and a half until they slowly petered out roughly 15 minutes outside of a little one-light town. I've had people try to carjack me, people try to rob me after I pull over to render aid, people jump out at me on twisty mountain road, you name it. But nothing matching that level of fear the first time I saw them. Felt like my spine was rippling like a ribbon in a wind trying to jump clear out of my back and hide under the seat. Sleep deprivation mixed with sensory deprivation does some strange things. Story number 7. When I first started learning to drive, I was working for my dad, and one day after work he asked if I wanted to drive home. I was like, all right. So I got on the highway headed for home, and while driving, I looked in the rear view and a guy on a crotch rocket was coming up behind me. I thought nothing of it. I was sure he would pass or slow down. I look ahead again and a few moments later I hear this sound, like metal scraping against the ground. I look around and then look back into the rear view, and the bike was on its side, spinning down the highway, and behind it I could see the biker on his back, legs and arms flailing kind of like a baby on its back in a crib. Then I watched as he disappeared under the vehicle behind him. I was so freaked out driving after that I didn't want to drive for weeks following the incident. Then eventually got over it. Still I can see the guy in my mind just sliding along the ground flailing about then being swallowed under another car. Story number 8. Not me but a friend. After dropping me off at my house around 2 a.m., my friend calls me and tells me to pick my doors. He said he saw a man standing in the middle of the road and that as he passed him the man kept staring through him. Not at him really, but like there was something behind him in his backseat. He also said he could barely make out anything about the man other than his large eyes and trench coat. What really terrified me is that this happened on a street that only my family lives on and no one would have been out that night. Also, we're a solid mile and a half from the nearest neighbor. Freaked me the hell out. Story number 9. I was following a gray Toyota Tundra in a massive blizzard through Montana on McDonald Pass. He was going pretty quick most of the way but must have been unfamiliar with how steep the final few miles are. He got away from me as I slowed down to about 35. Not 5 minutes later I passed his tire marks in the fresh snow that went off the side of the mountain. Pulled over and looked down to see his truck upside down and on fire about 300 yards down. Called 911. He didn't die but was burnt up pretty bad. Sad and scary, and don't go 50 in the snow just because you have a truck or 4WD. Story number 10. I had just finished driving for Uber and was driving down the access road to my home around 3 a.m. when I saw a body lying completely lifeless next to one of those motorized scooters. I pulled over and flagged down his buddies who were drunk and kept going without realizing their friend was lying on the ground. Ambulance arrived and took the kid away, but I never came to find out if he made it. Fuck those scooters, man. Story number 11. I had just finished driving for Uber and was driving down the access road to my home around 3 a.m. when I saw a body lying completely lifeless next to one of those motorized scooters. I pulled over and flagged down his buddies who were drunk and kept going without realizing their friend was lying on the ground. Ambulance arrived and took the kid away, but I never came to find out if he made it. Fuck those scooters, man. Story number 12. I was driving home late one night and was driving on a dark stretch of the highway. Suddenly a body was in front of me. I tried to swerve out of the way but it was too late. My bumper was hanging on the ground. The guy died, and I went to a nearby gas station not knowing what to do. Was 18. When the tow truck pulled my car up onto it, there were a bunch of blood and guts on the bottom. I couldn't get that image out of my head. Apparently a drunk driver with 5 DWIs had hit a guy on the motorcycle prior. For years after I had serious depression and thought about it every night before sleep. Story number 13. A hitchhiker almost leaping out in front of my car on a dark forest road late at night. The woman literally popped out of nowhere. Had to drift into the oncoming lane. Luckily there was no one else and painted median there. Read a police report that she ended up getting hit minutes after I drove by. She was intoxicated and running from the police. Pretty fucking creepy. I hope she's alright. I can't imagine what the driver that hit her was thinking. The end.